I'd like to start the session on the Haifites are making a lot of noise. Oh no, you're Bar-Ilan. We're continuing the session 5, philosophical and theoretical context of nonviolent resistance. And I would like to invite Dr. Adil Levy from University of Haifa, who will speak on nonviolent resistance, the ethical challenges. Please.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and after all that legal and political talk, I'm glad to move to talk a little about philosophy and ethics. And so I'm going to talk about the tactics of nonviolent resistance, and not so much about the causes. Not so much about the causes that leads civilians or citizens to resist their government or any other rule, but more about the tactics they utilize when they do so. So I want to begin with this picture, and I'm sure most of the people in the room have seen it. It became viral on social networks. And it's one of those pictures that, kind of makes you feel uncomfortable, even if you support. I mean, I think that even the keenest supporters of the civil resistance that we witnessed in recent months, I felt a bit uncomfortable when seeing that picture. That's the effect of children as emotionally stimulating young people who are helpless. In the burning heat of July, in buses and on the road, and obviously it led to a lot of criticism. There was some arguments that it was fake news. Other said that it's a symbol of a young baby protesting for democracy. But obviously, it feels awkward. It feels awkward. And now I want to take you 60 years backwards and show you this picture. This was taken in Birmingham, Alabama. The kids in this picture became to be known the children of the Children's Crusade, and they were encouraged by Martin Luther King, to fill the jails, to shake the conscience of the nation against the racial segregation laws in Birmingham, Alabama. And they did so. They filled the jails, children from the age of 4 to age of 17. They did as they were instructed. And the difference is that they made an impact. It was kind of a transformative event that led to change of legislation in the civil rights movement. And they did shake the conscience of the nation. So this kind of raises the question, is it morally permissible to use these tactics, even in the most extreme circumstances? And this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about whether or not this is violent or nonviolent, if this is harmful or not. But let's begin with some definitions. A nonviolent resistance technique avoids physical violence or the threat of physical violence, and instead relies on social, economic, and spiritual pressure to make political gains. So that's the theoretical definition. Was established by Gene Sharp, who is a prominent theorist of nonviolent resistance. He built his theory that includes about approximately 200 different tactics of nonviolent resistance on the philosophy of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, who are prominent thinkers. I'm going to talk about them. So this is theory. But this is not what we see today, okay? There are two kinds of nonviolent resistance. Some of them have spoken about conscientious objections, which is more of a moral resistance. And now there's also the strategic part of nonviolent resistance. So here it is. There are two types, theoretically. Principled nonviolence says that there should be no physical, emotional, social, or economic harm. The Ethics of Nonviolence by Martin Luther King says that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people, resist violence of the spirit, as well as of the body. That would mean that no emotional harm is permissible under that condition. Nonviolent holds that voluntary suffering can educate and transform. That basically means that we should endure harm instead of inflicting harm to other people. On the other hand, the pragmatic nonviolence says that nonviolent resistance, the strategic part of it, should not be confused with belief or ethical or religious nonviolence, okay? These are unrelated to struggle who hold these beliefs, and they are conducted for considerations of effectiveness, okay? So there are two different types of nonviolence, and the question is, which one is more effective? Or more so, is it possible to separate the moral weight of nonviolence from the strategic effectiveness of nonviolent resistance? Theory says that no. Despite that we like to think about nonviolent resistance as a strategic struggle that is conducted because it is effective, because it is able to mobilize participants, it still derives from the morality that nonviolence confers to it, okay? It needs the moral weight of nonviolence for several reasons, as I will discuss later on. And this raises two questions. Can nonviolent resistance succeed without inflicting harm? And can it succeed despite inflicting harm? Okay, so answering the first question, it's right here. NVR, nonviolent resistance, must avoid harm to mobilize participants. Research has shown that nonviolence has an ability to mobilize participants because it has no physical barriers. People aren't afraid to get hurt, okay, or harmed, and moral barriers. More people are likely to join a struggle if they believe in its way of conduct, and believe in its morality. It also must avoid harm to gain legitimization as a struggle that adheres to moral codes it is designed to secure or achieve, okay? So we want to protect human rights. We want to show that we respect human rights of others when we struggle for human rights. Enlist domestic support. Again, if nonviolent resistance enjoys widespread support, it is likely to be more effective. To get the support of celebrities, high-profile figures, intellectual, all these people are the circle that enables nonviolent resistance to make an impact. So again, it must avoid harm to do that. Enlist international support by respecting and promoting human rights. I'll show examples later how this works, but again, the respect for human rights or democratic moral codes are essential to gain support. On the other hand, NVR must inflict harm to exert pressure on the government. Okay, so blocking road strikes, demonstrations, and sit-ins, all these inflict harm on civilians, on citizens, in order to exert pressure on the government. Create social boundaries to perform NVR tactics. These relate to social, cultural, and economic boycotts. So we have to have a group who will suffer from the boycotts that nonviolent group would like to impose. That's why we hear a hostile language between intergroups, and we see it very vividly online today, but it is not something new. We've seen it before. I'll show some examples later. Disrupt order to draw media attention, provoke violence to generate criticism. This is the tactic called backfire. If you want to gain attention, if you want to shake the conscience of the nation, as Martin Luther King said, you need to provoke some kind of violence. Okay, so we have these two things that all these together make nonviolent resistance an effective tool. Let's begin with psychological harm. So moral jujitsu is a tactic, again, spoken in the literature of nonviolent resistance. That means that using nonviolent narratives to trigger a moral conflict within law enforcement personnel. So this kind of tries to create a gap between the nonviolent side and the violent police officers. Okay, when you stand without responding to violence, then the idea is that the law enforcement personnel would not be able to be violent against you. And there are several ways of doing that. Not only standing without being violent, but also tactics of fraternization that emphasizes social, national ties to encourage loyalty shifts, and incorporating children. Again, police officers are likely to wait a while before they use force to disperse demonstrations if children are involved. So that's great when it works. There's no problem with that. If it works and they are able to prevent violence from security forces, that's wonderful. But when it doesn't work, security forces become target of an online shaming campaign. And this is a picture that also was taken last week in the day of disruption of police officers that are doing their job. They decided not to disobey orders and actually follow the orders that were given. And they were doing the job, but they became a target of shaming campaign online for obeying their orders, for following their professional obligations. So in Israel, or in what we see, violence has not reached a severe condition, but in other places, such as Syria, for example, it did. And it caused a lot of people, a lot of law enforcement personnel to defect. A lot of the military soldiers defected because they didn't want to shoot at protesters. Of course, the costs were that they were executed. Some of them were executed, exiled, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is kind of the dilemmas that the soldiers or security forces face when they confront nonviolent resistors. Okay, instrumental violence, soliciting violence from the opponent to trigger international criticism. I already mentioned backfire. So that is one of the most popular tactics of nonviolent resistance. Again, the idea is to perform morally controversial tactics that would force the regime to respond in a way that is deemed disproportionate and would follow criticism from the domestic criticism and external criticism. So I'm going to give two examples for that. This is the marches of return in 2018, where Palestinians tried to break the border and get inside Israel. This is, some people would say it was a violent campaign. Palestinian protesters claim it is nonviolent. When asked about the incendiary kites or flammable balloons, they say it's a symbol of resistance. It's supposed to be some kind of again, symbolic violence. Okay, symbolic violence. It's not exactly to harm anybody, but the problem is that it kind of puts the regime in some sort of a problem. How exactly are you going to respond when each reaction you make is disproportionate against civilians? So this is the kind of the situations that nonviolent resistance would like to trigger. Another example, maybe even more famous, is Gandhi Salt March. Again, many Indians followed him to the salt mines in Dramsala, and they practice disobedience. They enter into the factory, and British used violence against them and oppressed the march. Of course, this became also a turning point because the British were depicted to the outside world as a very violent oppressor against nonviolent campaigners. The point here is that this cannot be described as nonviolent because whether or not participants are violent, there's no doubt that violence is here and that violence is necessary in order to create the effectiveness or the impact that nonviolent movements seek to create. The third thing is social harm. So discrimination and social divisions to apply tactics of social, cultural, and academic boycotts. So one example of that was in South Africa in 1986 in Port Victoria. Activists have decided to employ a boycott on all white businesses. Now that was to fight against racial segregation in South Africa. But obviously, apply a boycott on white people is also kind of racial discrimination. But what else are they going to do? Who are they going to boycott? So this is, again, a dilemma that is really, really hard to overcome because you have to create a social division in order to apply the tactics. Another more recent is the call-out culture that we hear about today, humiliating and shaming figures who disagree or refuse to support the movement. So we have the BLM, the Me Too, BDS, et cetera, et cetera. This is one letter that was published in Texas by a student who said, "White is over. I hate white people. Your DNA is an abomination." Again, creating these boundaries is necessary, first, to mobilize more people to your group, and second, to create, again, attention and maybe support by your other group. Obviously, it doesn't always work because this is like really inciting message, but it's also inevitable. We see it all the time in nonviolent resistance movement. So as for the second question, can nonviolent succeed despite inflicting harm? I think that the answer is, again, on the levels of harm. And this is where we need to think about where are the limits of inflicting harm on civilians who are not necessarily liable for that harm. And if we really need to humiliate an entire group in order to make a point, if we decide to use tactics such as instrumental violence, that we need to gain the consent of resistors. That doesn't always happen. And maybe there's supposed to be some kind of a balance between shaming security forces who obey orders and actually trying to other ways of getting them to support the struggle or maybe join the resistors in another way. Thank you.